Mark the date in your calendar, the 22nd of September, probably the earliest title decider we've experienced in Premier League history. Arsenal, Man City, at the Etihad. Harry's with me, Kweku as well. I'm going to start with you, because Arsenal go into this probably with some worries, shall we say. Odegaard injured, City coming into this with Haaland in form. And I think a lot of people are now starting to say, hold on a minute, this Arsenal team, there's some holes in this very perfect Arsenal side that people are talking about. Where are you up to right now?
I'm feeling pretty good. I think it's a very similar start to what you saw from Arsenal last season, where the results were there, but the performances weren't necessarily at the level that they're capable of. And over the course of the season, they got better and better, and they ended up finishing the campaign really strongly. So I'm pretty relaxed about that. You're right to mention injuries. They're a big problem for Arsenal at the moment. The squad is looking a little bit thin, and people are questioning whether or not Mikel Arteta was right to let some of the squad players go. It's done now. I think you just have to move on from that, and you have to focus on what you have rather than what you don't. But the Odegaard injury is a big, big blow to this team, because I don't think there's anybody in the squad that can come in and do that role, which means that the team has to adjust and adapt. And I don't know how long it's going to take them for them to get that right. And you don't want to be going away to Manchester City. You've called it a title decider. I'm not going to go that far because of the date.
If City win this game, you've got
5 points with them having to come to the Emirates.
Yeah, but you're saying it like that's a given that you're definitely going to win there.
Well, we have to win at the Emirates if we lose this game. There's no doubt about that. So,
yeah, and therefore you would regard this as an early title decider.
No, because if they could drop points somewhere else.
Where's Man City though? Like in the second half of the season, they're not going to drop points.
So who knows? You never know. It might not be the same Man City. We'll see.
I'm of the opinion. I think maybe it was us three last year when Arsenal went to the Etihad. I think I said that they had to win that game. And the general consensus was no, getting a point now was valuable. But I looked at the starting 11 that day. Now I'll put the shoe on the other foot and say City have to win this game. Because if I look at the Arsenal 11, I go, without Odegaard, City are fully fit. And they've got to smell blood in this scenario and go, let's hit them where it hurts. Because Arsenal momentum could go all over the place. Yeah. That's why I wouldn't say it's title decider in the sense that whoever wins is going to win the title. But I mean, it's an enormous momentum shifter.
Well, to piggyback off your point about last season, I think it's a misnomer to say that Arsenal didn't win the league because they didn't beat Man City at the Etihad. They settled for the draw. I do think there's other factors in Arsenal not winning the league, not beating Villa home and away. Getting beaten by Villa home and away has a huge part in it. Fulham home and away as well. I do think that with this Arsenal side going into this game without Odegaard, you can look to the injury to Kevin De Bruyne as leveling the playing field. At the time of recording, we don't know if he's going to play on the weekend, but he went off with an injury against Inter Milan. And I think we've seen over Kevin De Bruyne over the last couple of seasons, his body starting to break down. No doubt that he was the catalyst for City going on that incredible run towards back end of the season when he came into the team, or back into the team, that Newcastle game where he came back in and he created everything and he was just magic for them. But I think this is a big game for Arsenal, and to pin it as a title decider this early, I think is a little bit premature. But I do think the adage of to be the man, you got to beat the man is true. And I think that with Arsenal, the psychological hurdle of beating Man City at Etihad is still there. And that's why I think last season, a lot of Arsenal fans and Arteta himself would look at that as a good result, because we've seen Arsenal get turned over at the Etihad in multiple seasons. But the last time Arsenal won there was 2015. It was Yaya Toure fouled Monreal for the penalty that Cazorla scored. Then Olivier Giroud scored a goal in the second half. 3 of those 4 players I mentioned don't play football anymore, and Giroud's playing in America. And so that was a very long time ago. That's almost a decade ago. And I think for Arsenal, beating Man City at the Etihad will prove to them that they are competitive with the City side, who we all agree are one of the greatest Premier League sides of all time. But I do think that it's going to be tough for them without Martin Odegaard, who I do think is more important to Arsenal than De Bruyne is to Man City.
It makes for an interesting point around that game last year. It's really and truly, the 2 games are now very different because of the situation. But Arsenal against Spurs were rigid, difficult to break down. Last year against City, they were rigid, difficult to break down. Pep didn't seem to have an answer for it last year, but they did have injuries. If I remember correctly, there was no Haaland or De Bruyne for that game. Or maybe Haaland played, De Bruyne didn't play. So I wonder when they come into this one, City on one end have to find a way to break Arsenal down. Arsenal probably going to play exactly like they did against Tottenham.
Yeah, and I think they should.
Would you say that's boring or negative?
No, not at all. I think that it's just putting defensive solidity first. And when you don't necessarily have the tools to attack in the way that you want to attack, then you have to change it up a little bit. So if you look at the game against Spurs last weekend, Mikel Arteta had no choice but to bring Jorginho into the midfield. Now, everybody knows that Jorginho, as great as he is on the ball, isn't the most mobile. So if you're playing a system where you push on your 2-8s and you leave the 6 sitting at the base by himself, that can't be Jorginho. And I would argue that nowadays it can't even be Thomas Partey against the very best opposition. You need to find that balance. And the way Arsenal found that balance is by playing in what looks like a 4-4-2, by having the two central midfielders nice and compact, holding each other's hands essentially through the game. The wingers are working back and using Kai Havertz as a kind of go between the midfield and the centre forward position. So I think that's the right way to go. If you can't win it, and it's not, people always said about Arsenal last season when they went to the Etihad, they didn't want to win it. No, they realised that they couldn't win it. They realised that they were at a stage where if they committed more in terms of going forward, they were vulnerable on the break. And so they took a decision towards the end of the game, I believe, to just make sure they got out of there with a point. And that's how you should be. You should be pragmatists first, particularly when you're away. And in the circumstances of that game, Arsenal had beaten them at the Emirates earlier in the season. So to take 4 points off the team you're competing with is a good return. Yeah. So I've never really understood the whole narrative of Arsenal didn't win the league because they didn't go and win at City. They dropped points against Villa, they dropped points against Fulham, they dropped points against West Ham. That's where they didn't win the league, not at the Etihad.
I hear it. I think the point that I was making about last year's game, because I was one of the people like campaigning for the fact that Arsenal had to go for the kill, was that City, I think the back four was all over the place that day. If I'm not wrong, I'm pretty sure Rico Lewis played, and they were missing a couple of really important players. And so for me, that is an opportunity not only to dent their title hopes, but more so gain momentum yourself.
Arsenal were without Saka that day as well, which I think gets forgotten. Yeah. Gabriel Jesus played on the right flank.
But Harry, I would say that you remember, I don't know how much you remember it, the 2002 title race where you won it at Old Trafford. Silva and Wiltord scored. I remember the Chelsea 09-10 title race against Manchester United where Drogba scored at Old Trafford and Chelsea won the league. I do think there is something in going to your biggest rivals and beating them on their patch. It sends a clear message and it gives your team who haven't got the most experience in terms of winning trophies that confidence that you can go to the big places and get wins. And you did that last season. You did get results going away from home. But I think there's a big difference now in the Premier League with Man City setting such a high level. I think there's a big difference between a draw and a win. I think winning, not like Nubaid says, not only gives you confidence, but dents the confidence of the opposition. So going there and beating them this early in the season, I think for Arsenal will build that momentum.
I think it helps. And I think if you win, not only do you get the points advantage, you make up 3 points on your opponents, but you also get the psychological boost. I don't doubt for a second that winning would be massive, but I just find it difficult in September to say that a game is absolutely categorically must win. And I think if you go into it feeling that way, that nothing less than a victory will do, you almost bring a pressure upon yourselves that might not be helpful in the grand scheme of things.
I hear that, but from a psychological standpoint, I'm of the opinion if you want to be champions, you should feel that pressure every game. So
I think you do now. But
therefore, I think when you come up against City, if you're going into a game against City away from home going, as long as we don't lose, it's sound. I remember this being a Liverpool fan, and we didn't beat them many times, but every single time we played them, they felt like they were in a different sort of game. Like when I speak about that game last year, and just generally when you've gone to the Etihad, you're never going to win. And that they don't feel like you're going to win either. I think your job in this game, I don't know without Ødegaard, and we should really talk about that, but I don't know if your job is to win this game, but it's to make it feel like you're going to win. Because that feeling runs across. A lot of people will have watched the Spurs game and gone, that's a really professional performance and that's how you win league titles. That's against Spurs. Spurs are never going to lay a glove on you anyway. This is against, and that Chelsea-United rivalry you come to, the Arsenal-United rivalry, the biggest thing about those were you were taking the big team on and the ones that have been dominating and saying, you're no longer dominant anymore. If they turn up and beat you 3-0, they're still dominant.
I don't for a second doubt, though, that Mikel Arteta's message will be, we're going to go there and win. Like, internally, that will be the message. Let's go there and let's win. We're playing to win. His teams always play to win. But I do think there's something to be said for reading the game state as the game goes and taking decisions on the fly. That's what you need to do at the very highest level. If you're up against it, backs against the wall, you can't get hold of the ball. You're not going to overcommit players forward at 0-0 on 80 minutes to try and win because that's what you set out to do. Sometimes you have to adjust the game plan, I think. And that's what Arsenal were doing really well at the moment under Mikel Arteta. They realised early on in the game against Spurs that actually they're having a lot of the ball, but they're not getting through. And they focused on winning set pieces. Like, I don't care what anybody says, when Bukayo Saka went forward in that move that led to the corner.
It was a goal. Like, when the corner was given out, honestly, I was like,
exactly
I don't know why
that.
this is a goal.
Exactly that. He had a shot which got blocked. And when he recovered the ball, he looked up and he thought, let me get the corner. Yeah. Let me force the corner, because he'd realised earlier on in the game, and we'd seen it last season as well, that Spurs are vulnerable from those situations. Vicario was rattled in the first half. Mm-hmm. Everybody was getting in and among him. So what do? They get the corner, they drop it on top of the edge of the 6-yard box, and bang, there's Gabriel. So I do think sometimes you have to play the game and not be obsessed by a game plan that you enter a game with. And being able to make decisions on the fly and changing things is a really important skill to have. And that's what Arsenal have that they didn't have 2 years ago.
Do you think that Arsenal can take anything from Inter Milan's performance at the Etihad in the Champions League? Because that Inter Milan midfield was very impressive. Zelensky, Çalhanoğlu, Barella, who was amazing. And what that midfield had was that dynamism, players that were brave on the ball. And I think you've got to be brave on the ball at the Etihad. And players who knew their roles as well. If it wasn't for some poor decision-making in the final third from Thuram, I think that Inter Milan probably could have won that game. And I feel like this Arsenal midfield, despite the fact you are depleted, if you pick the right personnel, I think there's a chance to get a City, especially without Kevin De Bruyne. Now, Gundogan came off the bench and had some good chances, but when I looked to him in possession and the way that City were playing with him, it was very different to Gundogan a couple of years ago. I think that City are vulnerable in that area, and I think Arsenal can impose their will, which Inter Milan did with those midfielders who knew their role. Do you think that's a place that you can exploit at City?
Yeah, I think what Arsenal have in their armoury now that they didn't have previously, and this is partly down to the arrival of Kai Havertz, is the ability to go over the top of you.
Yeah.
And if they're being pinned back, because Manchester City will try and do that, they'll try and hunt the ball down high up. That's what they do. But having that ability to go over the top and hit someone like Kai Havertz, who can win the ball either with a knockdown or bring it down, I think Bukayo Saka's ability to win aerial duels is massively underrated. For someone of his size, he wins an awful lot of them. And if you can go over the top of someone, then you can hurt them. If a team's playing with a high line, which City will, granted, they've got a lot more quality than Spurs. And if you let them throw punches the way Spurs were, they're going to knock you out. Spurs couldn't, but City will. Yeah. So there has to be a bit more balance to the game.
Was it the Community Shield game or was it the game at your place where they did that thing where they brought, I think Havertz came off the bench and you went longer and it completely affected them? What was that?
That was the game at the Emirates, where he came on, and in the end, the goal came actually from Tomiyasu bombing down the left-hand side. Arsenal going long to him, and he won a knockdown, which then fell to Martinelli, who had a bit of luck with the deflected shot. But the point I'm trying to make is that Arsenal are not scared to say, let's change our way now. We don't need to play through you all the time. We don't need the tiki-taka stuff. If they want to go long, they can. They now have the weapons to do that as well. And that's what makes them a more complete side.
Interesting stuff. We could talk about this all day. Also, it feels unfair to not mention the fact that Erling Haaland has 9 Premier League goals, which is more than 19 teams this season.
The Norwegian elephant in the room. That's the big factor as well. Because
is there Norwegian elephant?
He didn't score against Inter Milan in the Champions League, but he's a striker that looks rejuvenated after having a break during the summer. Obviously, he would have loved to be at the Euros with Norway, but they didn't make it. But he's a player that I think if he gets going early and he has joy against Arsenal centre-backs early doors, then that could be problems. We saw Gabriel last season shut him down really effectively, and I think you need more of the same from that. And I think Saliba has to be a bit more cerebral. We've heard Saliba talk as well before this game about how he thinks he's one of the best defenders in the world, but he needs to start winning titles. And so matching up against Erling Haaland, who has won titles, who has been a top goal scorer in this league for the last couple of seasons, I think is a huge matchup. But I think Gabriel, who's a player that we've discussed ad nauseum in terms of how good is he actually, I think he's got a huge job in terms of trying to shut down Erling Haaland.
What I also think is interesting is at the start of the Spurs game, Solanke was giving Saliba a lot of problems for the first 15 minutes, and it was interesting that he chose to go after Saliba than Gabriel. So it'll be interesting to see what Haaland chooses. And most of the time, Haaland makes good decisions of who he comes up against. But anyway, let's get your predictions for this one. Harry, I'll let you go first.
I'm going to go Manchester City 0, Arsenal 0.
This brother don't want to win title. Jose Mourinho. Kweku?
I was going to go for a draw.
What's happening here?
I know, but
Well, if City drew 0-0 in midweek in Europe, the chances of them drawing a blank at home again, it is not very high, but I'm confident in Saliba and Gabriel.
I think Arsenal win, mate. I think Arsenal win. I was going to go for a draw. I think Arsenal win. I think Arsenal win 2-1. This is not me saying that Arsenal win the league, because I do not think this is a title decider. But I think that this Arsenal team, buoyed by the confidence of beating Spurs on the weekend in a tough game away from home against their biggest rivals, I think Arsenal go into this one with the confidence that they can take on anyone in the league. And I think they turned those draws from last season into wins, and they beat City at the Etihad 2-1.
Yeah, I don't see that. I don't see that in any world, because also they've only created 5 XG this season. So they'd need a fair bit of XG.
Can't change my answer.
Should have looked at the stat sheet, brother. I'm going to go 2-0 City. I don't see Arsenal scoring. I see Haaland scoring. And I can't see 1-0. I don't know why. So that is what I'm going to go for.